Now, today we pick up with the book of James. How many chapters does Hebrews have?
13.
You're sure?
Yep.
How many verses? I'm just joking. How many chapters does James have? One says 4, one says 6.
5.
I remember the second time because there was reference in James 5. Get that 4.
Yes, that's right. Okay, so we have 5 chapters here. What are Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st and 2nd and 3rd John, and Jude called? The Catholic epistles, the general epistles. Catholic means applicable to Christianity, universal, throughout the world. This is an important, which? Well, Paul's books were more limited. They were written like specifically to individuals or to local churches, whereas these were more general. They were not addressed to, say, a church. They were addressed to people, groups, like either to Jewish Christians in general.
So it's not actually included.
Yes, that's a good point of clarification. My bad choice of words. Right? All the scriptures are applicable to all of us, but they were originally written to a larger group of people than the Pauline epistles. Now, the book of James is an important little book because, for several reasons. It gives us a good deal of additional information about important early church leaders, James, Peter, and John. When the Apostle Paul had been saved and had gone into Arabia and had grown in his relationship with the Lord, he had gone to Jerusalem shortly thereafter, and he had met Peter, James, and John. By the time Paul came on the scene, these men were known as, quote unquote, the pillars of the church, Galatians chapter 2, verse 9. And James gives us insight into the world of James and his outlook, his mentality. 1st and 2nd Peter give us a good deal of information about Peter, and same thing with John's letters. They've all matured, and they each have their own unique emphasis. If we did not have the book of James, we would know less about the Jewish form of Christianity in the first century than we would otherwise know, because Paul stresses the Gentile aspect of Christianity. Right? So James is important because it tells us about the Jewish form of Christianity. James is also important because it shows us how James adapted the gospel to the particular conditions of his world. So it sort of gives us a lesson in how we can learn to adapt the scriptures. For example, if you were going to be a missionary to a tribe somewhere whose language had not even been reduced to writing, let alone the concepts of their culture and everything like that, it would be useful to know a couple of key principles on how James, for example, applied the gospel to the Jewish culture, how Paul applied the gospel to the Greek culture. See, if you understand some basic guidelines or principles, then you could take this and you could go and use it to help guide you in the way you would deal with a particular tribal culture. And so James, like these other books, show us how the gospel was adapted to a particular people group, the Jews in this case. James is also important because it gives us a picture of the early church life, very early in the days of the church, in a time when Christians were social outcasts and were exploited and persecuted. Everyone should remember, what did the early Christians in Jerusalem do? Out of necessity, to be able to survive in a hostile Judaistic culture. What did they do? They formed communities, right? In those days, people were excommunicated within the Jewish culture when they joined the Christian faith, right? They were kicked out. And so they would lose their job, they'd be kicked out of their homes, they couldn't live at home. So out of necessity, the Christians found it necessary to stick together, band together. And so James sort of fits that era of time, I believe. Gives us an early picture of the church. Sort of fits Acts chapter 2, 3, and 4, and 5. Now, why do we have James in the Bible? A.T. Robertson says that the book of James is written, if it was written to non-Christian Jews, then it was written to win them to Christ. It was written to put the gospel in a Jewish way. Go downstairs and play, son. Probably, however, he says, the book of James was written mainly to strengthen the faith and loyalty of Christian Jews who were being persecuted. Do you think you could find a passage in the book of James just offhand that would sort of evidence that conclusion? Sure, the opening chapter seems to focus on the trials of believers. And likewise, the last chapter in the book. That be patient. The prophets suffered, and they were patient too. They've given us an example, and he pronounces judgment on those that are persecuting the poor. Well, most of the early Christians were poor. They were members of the poor classes of society. So the first and last chapters of the book of James sort of introduce and conclude with an attitude that the Christians were being mistreated. So the book was written to encourage, I believe, strengthen them. Henry Thiessen says that the book of James was probably written to meet the needs of Jews dispersed throughout the Roman world. And therefore, help takes very specific forms. Specific secondary purposes of the book of James then would be to help them have a right attitude towards trial in chapter 1. The book is written to encourage them to be receptive to the scriptures, also in chapter 1. The author was also warning them not to become discriminatory, not to develop a us versus them mentality, and to look down on other people who were not Christians, like themselves. Chapter 2. Another purpose of the author was to encourage them to show their faith, not just profess it. He was advocating a a workable, practical Christianity. He's also in this book warning against the sins of the tongue. Chapter 3. He's warning against quarrelsome and worldliness and pride in chapter 4. He warns them in chapter 5 to be ethical in their business dealings. He encourages them in chapter 5 to be patient under trial. He also gives them some practical encouragement in how to help themselves in their own interrelationships as believers. How to restore fellowship and how to deal with problems in their midst. So, how to encourage one another, chapter 5. Right, so these are the primary and the secondary purposes of the book. Encourage believers and in a number of specific practical areas. Let's talk about the authorship and the background to the book a little bit. The book opens with a man by the name of James addressing the 12 tribes that are scattered abroad. So there's an allusion here in a sort of a Jewish orientation by a man named James. How many Jameses are there mentioned in the New Testament? Can you name a James? Pardon? Okay, so there was one of Jesus' disciples named James. Right? Peter, James, and John. What else? Yes, one of Jesus' brothers was called James. Right? Now, I think there was another James too. I don't recall right off, but there were, I think, at least 3 James mentioned, and the book before us claims to be from James, and there's been some controversy as to exactly who this might have been. Most people are convinced that it probably was not John the Apostle's brother James, because he was killed early in the days of the church, right? In Acts chapter 12, Herod had his head cut off, had James's head cut off at the time when Peter was in jail. Remember that? And Peter was miraculously delivered by the angel. So the only Jameses that were left outside of perhaps an anonymous James, someone, not an anonymous James, but a James that we probably don't know, would be the brother of Jesus, and in fact this is what tradition says, who tradition says was the author of this book. Here are a list of references that relate to James. Acts chapter 12 verse 17. Galatians 1:19. Acts 15:13 to 21. Acts chapter 21 verses 18 to 25. John chapter 7 verse 6. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 7. Acts 1:14. First Corinthians 9:5. Galatians 2:12. And Matthew chapter 13 verse 55. You could probably also put down John chapter 2 verse 12 if I hadn't already given you that. Okay, now some of these references. The Galatians 1:19 reference shows that James was a leading figure in the leadership of the Jerusalem church. Acts 15, he more or less chaired the meeting that was the council that was called to try to solve this question over whether or not people needed to be circumcised to be saved. Acts chapter 21 verses 18 to 25 shows that he was still the leading elder in the city of Jerusalem at the time of Paul's last visit there. In John chapter 7 verse 6, that's a passage you should be familiar with. We just studied it. What does that tell you about James? Look it up. John chapter 7 verse 6. Doesn't mention him by name. But what does it tell you about him? Pardon? 7, 5, and 6. Okay. Apparently, while Jesus was beginning his public ministry, up until Jesus died, James probably remained a skeptic regarding his half brother, Jesus. But 1 Corinthians 15:7 says that Jesus specifically appeared to James after his resurrection. That's probably what caused his conversion, right? Pardon? Yeah, it would. Especially if he'd seen his brother die. Okay? Acts chapter 1 verse 14 shows that he was in the upper room before Pentecost. 1 Corinthians 9:5 tells us that he was married. He became known as James the Just. He was an anti-Judaizer. He was against the Judaists. He became involved in the controversy up in Antioch, Galatians chapter 2. Apparently he remained a friend of Paul's to the end, Acts 21. Clement of Alexandria says that James died after being flung from the temple, stoned, and beaten to death. Josephus says that James was stoned about 62 AD by the Sadducees. He had the same mother as Jesus, but a different father. And was in Jerusalem about 35 to 36 AD when Paul went up there and visited, Galatians chapter 1. The church historian Eusebius cites a tradition that Peter, James, and John chose James the Just, that is Jesus' brother James, as the Bishop of Jerusalem. And so we probably have here a letter or a book written by the very brother of Jesus, the half-brother of Jesus. He certainly doesn't identify himself as the brother of Jesus, because in humility he takes the title as a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. He knows his position. He's been greatly humbled by his former unbelief and having been proven wrong by the resurrection of Christ. So that would be a humbling experience. There's been a lot of controversy over the authenticity of the book of James down through church history, but the book of James is certainly in harmony with what Josephus teaches and what the book of Acts and Galatians and tell us, and what we know about the known circumstances of the Jewish dispersed peoples. The supposed contradiction between James and Paul is imaginary. If the book was a forgery, the guy would, whoever it was, if it was a forgery, wouldn't have picked an obscure man by the name of James to, he would have picked some bigger man to probably identify himself. The book certainly has a deep sense of spirituality. So, for all intents and purposes, this book is an authentic book of Scripture, and it has been included in the canonical books for many, many years. What caused this book to be written? What's the historical background to it? A.T. Robertson says that the general epistles of Peter, James, and John are scattered in their dates of writing all the way from about 45 AD to 90 AD. And he places James very early. Probably, he says, it may indeed be the earliest New Testament book. Okay? So, A.T. Robertson says that this is the earliest book of the New Testament. If he adds this book is a genuine book, and if James was actually put to death in 62 AD, like tradition says, obviously the book of James had to have been written before 62 AD. And there are two theories. Either it was written about 48 AD because of its similarities to the Sermon on the Mount, and because there is no reference to Gentile Christians as there would have been after 50 AD. Or it was written about 58 AD. Or a third view, it was written between 75 and 125 AD, because there is no reference to the destruction of Jerusalem or anything like that.
It's a wide range of...
Yes, a lot of variety there. Robertson and Thiessen take the early date.
Yeah, we take the later date.
That's right. Okay. Thiessen says that he refers to this tradition that James was killed in 62 AD from Josephus, and he adds that the internal evidence in the book of James puts the date even earlier, since the church order and discipline was very simple. There's no mention of bishops or deacons. They were still evidently practicing synagogal type meetings. The whole issue of whether or not Gentiles could be part of the church wasn't even an issue. So that places it around 48, 49 AD. He takes the early date. But he says it is obvious that the recipients of the book were not recent converts. And so he suggests, Thiessen suggests, that the book of James was probably written about 45 to 48 AD, shortly after Stephen was stoned. This is when persecution was fairly rampant in the area of Judea. Now, to understand the nature of this book, let's just conclude then that James was likely written by Jesus' brother, and that it was written, let's say, 45 to 48 AD, and it was written to, as it says, to the 12 tribes of Israel, or to the 12 tribes scattered abroad. So we're talking about Jewish dispersed peoples. And it would be natural for a Jewish man who was saved and a leader of the Jerusalem church and who had a concern for Jewish people to hear the good news of Jesus Christ, it would be very natural for a man like that to write a tract, as you were, if you wish, to try to convince Jews in other parts of the Roman world that had not heard about Jesus Christ about what was happening. See? And in essence, perhaps to encourage the Jewish believers that had become saved and had to move out, because of persecution and everything, as in the days of Stephen, to encourage them. Right? So it would be very natural for a letter like this to be written. This is what Thiessen suggests. He says that in the history of Israel, many Jews had been transplanted because of politics or because of commercial interests. And many of these Jews would be Christians. Acts chapter 6 verse 9. Acts chapter 9 verses 2 to 25. Talks about the persecutions. And Christians spreading out over the Roman Empire. Acts chapter 4 verses 36 and 37. Acts chapter 11 verses 19 and 20. Thiessen suggests that there were three specific reasons why the book was written, that historical occasions. A, he says, that the Jewish Christians were being persecuted, treated unjustly by their fellow countrymen, and all kinds of physical problems at this time. B, he says, the author evidently detected wrong attitudes and speech and strife and divisiveness, a worldly spirit. So they had a declining spiritual state of these Jewish Christians. And thirdly, the author evidently detected some doctrinal misconceptions. As if just having the right beliefs and the right profession was sufficient. A.T. Robertson sort of gives us the bigger picture. He says, as the leading elder of the great church in Jerusalem and as a devout Jew and half-brother of Jesus, the message of James had a special appeal to these widely scattered Jewish Christians. John Phillips says that this letter could have well been written to those who had been present in Jerusalem on the day of Pentecost and who had left. That's an interesting idea. Right? On the day of Pentecost, there were several thousand people saved. And the day after that, another several thousand. and these people were from all parts of the Roman world, but they were Jews, devout Jews, and many of them were saved, and so they needed instruction. That could be suggests why the book was written. All right. Let's talk. Oh, we're out of time now. We'll pick up next class with the subject matter of the book of James, keys to the book and outlines.